In this week's episode, I'm joined by Dorie Clark, she/her, Wall Street Journal bestselling author and professor of executive education at Columbia Business School. This week, our conversation is about inclusive care with a smile, raising the curtain on neurodivergence, toasting respect, and more. Hey there, my name is Bernadette Smith, and I'm a keynote speaker and writer. My pronouns are she and her. Welcome to 5 Things in 15 Minutes, my weekly show where I bring good vibes to DEI. That is good vibes to diversity, equity, and inclusion with a little dash of corporate social responsibility. What I found is there are lots of news stories about what's going wrong in the world and lots of negative data. But there are also a lot of things going right. That's what I like to focus on. I search for stories that we can be inspired by and learn from. My hope is to inspire you to experiment with some of these actions and policies to help you build a more inclusive world. Welcome to the show, Dorie. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Bernadette, thank you. Great to talk to you.
Tell us a little bit about you and your work and your most recent book. I love that book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'll wave it. It's called The Long Game: How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how we can stay focused on the big picture and working toward the goals that we all say are important to us without getting pulled away, as we so often do, into the short term, the urgent, the emergencies, some of which are important and some of which are not actually. So I want us all to be able to make better decisions in the moment so that we can have better outcomes down the road.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know that you're not exactly in the DEI space, but you have such a big picture view of this landscape, sort of given the work that you're doing with business leaders. So I think it's great having you on the show on a day in which I wrote about some of the challenges that we're seeing in this week's 5 Things newsletter. Last week I was delivering a keynote and an audience member asked, how do we make mandatory DEI training successful? And my response was, call it something else. So I really feel like we've gotten to this place where, DEI is definitely experiencing whiplash. So kind of what's been your take on all of it kind of from the big picture?
Yeah, I think your instinct is not wrong, actually, Bernadette. DEI certainly has become a very politicized term, one that people in certain quarters love to hate. And it distracts from so many of the good things, which at its core, if you're positioning it to people as, hey, here's how to treat people respectfully so they will be happy and perform well at work. I mean, that's not exactly a objectionable premise, and yet it's gotten so much heat on it. Sort of stripping it back and getting back to first principles, I think, is helpful. I mean, certainly recently, SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, took a step toward this by suggesting that we ease out the equity part of it, which I think is smart. I mean, I'm not even sure. I mean, these are sort of like collective things that somehow magically happen. At a certain point, we somehow went from D&I, diversity inclusion, to DEI, and that became the preferred term of art. But to me, equity was always a really questionable premise. At a fundamental level, we're guaranteeing outcomes. I don't know about that. That doesn't actually seem like a great idea to me. So getting rid of it, I'm a fan.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think when I think about equity, I think about creating more level playing field opportunities. But I also realize that is very polarizing for folks because so many people come from disadvantaged backgrounds for a whole host of reasons, right? And so people don't want to be pitted against each other. And I think that's sort of the risk with all of this. But a conference board survey of 60 executives found that over 50% have adjusted their terminology while continuing the fundamental work. So I think that's really important that we have to keep this work going. My vision is for DEI or equity and inclusion to sort of be the default because it's just the way smart business decisions are made.
Yeah, I think that that's an important point, and it's certainly one of the flashpoints over time that has continually arisen, which is, should DEI, or whatever we call it, be its own separate thing, or should it be integrated into the operations of the company? And of course, the argument is that there's more attention, there's more focus if it's its own separate thing. But it's also true that when things get hot, it gets easier to get rid of it because they're all right here, and also it runs the risk of becoming this sort of separated off fiefdom where they're not really central to the business operations and people don't listen to them. So there's arguments to be made for both cases, but I would tend to lean toward your position, which is that if it can be integrated into the core of business operations, it both makes it more resilient, and also it does tie it back better to business outcomes, which is, really the reason we're here anyway.
That's actually, I completely agree. I mean, that's the premise of my book, Inclusive 360, which is all about embedding it into every function of an organization. And I think it's really helpful to remember, folks, that none of this is quick. It's a long game, as you know. DEI, equity and inclusion, all of it is increasing diversity. All of it is such a long game. So folks, have patience and keep up your individual everyday actions towards respect, kindness, and equal opportunity, because that's where we really need to get to. All right, let's move into this week's Good Vibes. The first story this week is from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Their inclusive dental care clinic is reshaping care for patients with disabilities by adding wheelchair-accessible equipment with a lifting mechanism to position patients safely, eliminating their need for transfers. There are also rooms where patients can decompress with calming lights and tailored music, and specific training for dental students on inclusive care. And believe it or not, this is pretty rare, Dorie.
Yeah, that is unfortunate that it's very rare. I mean, of course, if you're someone who's in a wheelchair, for obvious reasons, it's nice to have a little bit more autonomy and to not have to have randos hoisting you places. And I can understand why they wouldn't have it everywhere because it's expensive. But it's certainly a really kind thing to do, and a thing that in as many places as it's feasible to do it, I think sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be hoisted by a rando, so,
Who does, really?
All right. The second story this week comes from the Biden administration, where President Biden formally apologized to Native Americans for the harm caused by government-run boarding schools that separated Indigenous children from their families. So this was a 150-year period where over 18,000 children were taken. This period ended in 1969, and at least 973 died. Biden acknowledged this as a blot on American history. I'm glad there's some acknowledgement.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem on balance worth apologizing for. I mean, I have to call out. I mean, of course, in a world where everything's political, I'm certainly voting Democratic, but it strikes me in terms of timing is like, okay, so we're apologizing right now for a thing that ended 50 years ago that has to do with separating children from their parents. Oh, okay. That doesn't have any political overtones at all. Like it seems a little too on the nose to me. Honestly, I feel like if he had done it a while ago, it would have looked a little less like a political football that he's kicking to score points. But,
Fair.
Okay, I'll give it to him. An apology seems reasonable. So better now than never.
Yeah, I mean, Dorie, listen, I would never have any stories on the show if I if I didn't have stories that fell into the category of better late than never, or better now than never, or finally we can celebrate this. Because listen, I mean, there is a lot out there. There's so much negativity out there. So, and recently finding stories of positivity has been a lot more difficult.
Yes.
So I will take the win. Yeah, there's so much work to do, but I will take this acknowledgement. And it seems like a lot of folks from the Native American communities, the National Congress of American Indians, are just grateful that this is finally being acknowledged. All right, the third story this week comes from PBS Kids, which debuted Carl the Collector, an animated series following Carl, an autistic raccoon, and his neurodivergent friends. Set in Fuzzy Town, Carl's adventures showcase each character's unique strengths, creating space for empathy and understanding around neurodiversity. And there's a lot of neurodiverse folks on the creative team as well.
Yeah, that's adorable. That's adorable. I mean, I can believe that raccoons are probably neurodiverse, right? Like my cat, I'm totally convinced one of my cats has anxiety and one of my cats has ADHD. So, you just love them and say, okay, boys, you've each got some strengths here, and we're gonna work with your emotional palette. So I think that not only are there probably autistic raccoons, it's certainly a nice thing for kids to get to see themselves represented in cute and cuddly form. So 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, I mean, these stories, kids they need to see themselves represented, because I don't know about you, but I felt really alone. I mean, when I was growing up, there were no possibility models for queer kids. So there was nothing to look up to in the media, certainly not in cartoons, certainly not at that age.
Are you forgetting Scooby-Doo? I mean, everybody was had some suspicions about Velma. But I agree, it was under the radar.
That's right. I mean, I was Velma for Halloween a few years back, so I had my suspicions as well. Yeah, but you're right. Everything was under the radar, right? And so having this representation can make a big difference for folks just in feeling seen, especially if they don't get a ton of support at school or at home. All right, the fourth story this week. This is an unusual story. My shout out to my nephew Terry Walsh for sending this one over to me. The Dead Rabbit and the Irish Exit Bars in New York have renamed Black and Tans, a drink with a name tied to painful history. Instead, the drink will be called the 50-50 as an alternative, keeping Irish culture respected and authentic. So the Black and Tan name recalls historical trauma from the Irish War of Independence, the Troubles. And the bars previously removed the Irish car bomb drink from their menus. So a little bit of different celebration on St. Patrick's Day at these bars.
And that is for sure. And this was especially salient for me because my place in New York actually is in the financial district, so it's very close to the Dead Rabbit. I've been to the Dead Rabbit. I tried to take my wife, in fact, recently to the Dead Rabbit, and it was just like so overstuffed with people and so popular we couldn't even get in. So it is a very popular venue. So yeah, this is one I feel like I'm putting an asterisk on because I have no idea about the sort of emotional salience of this for Irish people. I mean, to an American audience, it's like Black and Tan. Okay, it's Black and Tan. It's like a dachshund, it's like, it has nothing. But if there's actually legitimate Irish people that are traumatized by this, then awesome, great. It's always a little hard to know without an actual, like panel of Irish people in the room. Like, are they being slightly oversensitive about this? Like, because there are sort of hipster nods to things,
Sure.
But so this is one that I will chalk up to. I do not know enough about the soul of the Irish to evaluate, but Godspeed.
You know what, Dorie? My parents were born in Ireland, and I'm an Irish citizen, and I do not know enough about the soul of the Irish to evaluate this as well. The Troubles were not part of my childhood. They were not part of my parents' stories. Anything I learned about them was from, U2 and books and film.
And Yates and whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I did not know this was a sensitive issue. In my raucous St. Patrick's Day years of past, I have had an Irish car bomb or two. I've certainly had a black and tan or two. So I didn't realize that these had that potential stigma for folks. So, but it's interesting. What I think is so interesting is that there's so many random ways to be inclusive, and there's so much that we don't know about what other people are triggered by, right? So fascinating stuff. All right. The fifth story this week is about the Seats on the Spectrum initiative, which is redefining theater accessibility by offering neurodivergent friendly seats for regular Broadway shows. So last year, only 9,000 autism friendly tickets were available compared to 12.3 million attendees. But starting this fall, participating theaters are making aisle seats, calming spaces, and sensory-friendly materials like fidget toys and headphones available for all shows, as well as including staff training.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I actually went to a show last year that was directed by a friend and colleague of mine named Sammy Canold in her Broadway debut, which was called How to Dance in Ohio. And it was such a great show. It was really terrific. And it was based on a documentary, a musical based on a documentary, which was about a group of autistic young adults in Ohio, and they are planning a dance, not surprisingly, and so it's talking about sort of all the dynamics associated with that. But it was the very first show, not only to to have and sort of the cast is sort of representing all autistic people basically, but it's also autistic actors who are doing it. So it was really interesting. And the night that I went, it had been announced that it was closing, and it was just a few performances before the end. And it was really remarkable to see how meaningful the show was to an autistic audience, because there was a pack of people near the back of the auditorium that obviously had seen the show many times. They were like singing along and mouthing all the lines and everything. They were like the groupies. And it seemed clear that, they were a group of autistic folks who it really resonated for. So that was very, that especially because of the subject matter, it was like their show. So, so almost night was kind of like their place. So I think it is really interesting to see theaters experimenting with trying to make it so that every show can be your show, and that it doesn't have to, that it theme. Always the challenge with this is you also don't want to create a situation where somehow it's disruptive for other patrons, because I'm a fan of the, you can swing your fist as far as you want as long as it doesn't hit my face. And so all about these things, but I'm assuming that they are. So, awesome.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's, you have to find the balance, but more and more folks are somehow neurodivergent, and they should have this access as well. So finding the right balance, I think, is key. And I'm just grateful that there's a lot more thoughtfulness put into this, a lot more intention. And hopefully the balance will find itself as it starts to, as it starts to normalize, essentially, right? That's where we really got to get to, where these different elements of inclusion and elements of representation are just the way things are done, kind of bringing back the topic from the beginning. Is this should just be the default. So I love it. All right, Dorie, it has been awesome having you on the show. Before we go, let's move into this week's Good Vibes to Go. I have a good vibe to go to share. Do you have one you would like to share with our listeners?
Sure. Do you want to go first, or should I go first?
Sure, I'll go first. This week's good vibe to go for me is to watch Rez Ball on Netflix. It's a drama about a high school basketball team in New Mexico competing for the state championship. Really authentic storytelling. It's just a moving piece. I loved it. It's a great watch. So highly recommend Rez Ball on Netflix.
And what I will share is, my happy news is that I got married 3 days ago. Really nice. And I was very, I feel like sometimes you have to work a little harder at this, but all of the people who got us cards, they were either like, sort of gender neutral wedding cards, or my mother and my aunt and uncle both got me the same card, which is, this like papyrus or something, champagne glass, Mrs. and Mrs. So I love it that they have that people can buy at a store. That's pretty nice. And also, a sort of anti shout out that my now wife, who is like the biggest Etsy fan in the world, kept having a lot of trouble on Etsy because she would be looking for wedding things. And for many sellers, not all obviously, but for many of them, it is all heterosexual stuff. Like you can't even buy it. You can't even give them money to have gay wedding stuff. And I know this is your world, Bernadette. You came up in it, so you know it well. But shout out for the people who are creating options, so it's not quite so hard for guests to send a little thing.
That's a good vibe to go. There we go. All right. Thanks, Dorie. How can folks get in touch with you?
Well, thank you, Bernadette. The best way to find me is, my book is The Long Game, How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in the Short-Term World. And the best thing I do, where most of my cognitive energy goes, is my newsletter, which has a lot of, I like to think, legitimately quality content.
Newsletter.
And it's just go to dorieclark.com/subscribe, and you can sign up and see for yourself.
It's great. It's great stuff. All right. Thanks, Dorie. Great to have you on the show. And folks, if you don't already get the 5 Things newsletter, you can subscribe at 5thingsdei.com. Thanks a lot. Have a great week. Thank you for listening to 5 Things in 15 Minutes. I hope you found yourself inspired by at least one of this week's stories. If you did, would you mind sharing it with a colleague and leaving us a review on your favorite podcasting platform? And if you don't already get my 5 Things newsletter, join at 5thingsdei.com. I'm Bernadette Smith, and I'll see you next week right here for 5 Things in 15 Minutes, bringing good vibes to DEI.